Hello, and welcome to the third video about this dress. The last two videos got me to this point where I have all of my fabric cut and I'm ready to sew. The first thing I need to do is flatline the laser cut fabric and the matte satin. So I've pinned the front and back bodice pieces together. I also marked the front darts on the shell fabric and lining, so I will sew those too. When you flatline, you want to sew along the edge of the fabric within the seam allowances and make sure the fabrics are completely flat. I'm sewing from the back side so the foil-coated spandex doesn't bunch up under the foot of my machine. It's a knit and it wants to stretch, so the feed dogs help pull it along evenly. I'm also feeling to make sure none of the fabric is folded under. I'm sewing the darts just like I did on the fit sample, and I'm treating the matte satin and laser cut spandex like they're one fabric. Start at the wide part and end right at the point. Leave long tails to knot them together, and then I use a hand needle to thread the tails back through the dart before trimming the thread. I'm using a ham to press my darts, first in half to set the stitches, then with the dart folded the way the pattern suggests. For me, it's pressed towards center, but for larger bust sizes, they're pressed open. Next, I can put on the fake binding. To do this, I'm marking the 1/2 inch seam allowance around the arm's eye, and marking a 1/2 inch on the binding. Then I'm going to pin the binding right up to that 1/2 inch seam allowance, being careful not to stretch it. You could also cut 2-inch binding and only mark the stitch line at 1 inch. The extra will be trimmed away anyway. I'm sewing just to the right of the stitch line. Then the binding will fold over and meet the edge of the fabric. I'm pressing the binding into place and trimming away the extra seam allowance, just a little more than a 1/2 inch so the fabric can fold around it without bunching. Now I can sew the yoke onto the front bodice. I opened up the flat lining at the V and put a little piece of fusible tricot at the inside of the point to control it. Then close back up the flat line. I'm marking the seam allowance on the leather and the center of the point. I'm using wonder clips instead of pins. These are really handy. I'm only pinning together one side to start so that I can sew just up to the point. Then I snip the V almost to the needle so I can pivot, pin together the other side, and continue sewing. I want the yoke to be dominant in the dress, so I'm snipping away the bulk at the point and then top stitching the seam allowance up onto the leather. Repeat for the lining and press. I'm pressing the lining seam allowance down so there's not as much bulk above the seam line. Now it's time to attach the neck straps. I've decided on strips of chiffon instead of ribbon. I ripped 2 pieces of chiffon about 5 inches wide, and I'm going to give them a press and a French seam, which is an enclosed seam. So I'm sewing the entire length with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance and closing one end. You can see I'm pulling the back of the fabric. Since this is on the straight grain, I can keep tension in front and behind the needle so the fabric doesn't pucker. Then I trim away the seam allowance down to about an 1/8 inch and very carefully turn it inside out. Then I went back to the machine for the second stitch in the French seam. Using the first stitch as a guide, I'm gently pulling the fabric and stitching it a 1/4 inch to enclose that 1/8 inch seam allowance. And I turn the corner to finish one end. Then I turn it inside out again, which is right side out now, and I give it a good press. I made the straps wider than the bodice shoulder so I could give them a little pleat. Those get sewn into the bodice shoulders, being sure to stay clear of the 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side. Now I need to make the back bodice pieces. I want to put more of that tricot interfacing at the center back where the zipper will go, so I'm going to open up the flat lining. Yes, I should have thought about this before flatlining, but I forgot. I'm fusing a 1-inch strip of tricot to the center back of the laser cut fabric to stabilize it. Now that that's out of the way, I need to resize my zipper. I marked the seam allowance at the center back of the pattern piece and then marked on the zipper where it needs to end. I'm using a Leatherman or multi-tool to remove the zipper stops. I need to be careful doing this because I want to reuse them. A little bit of prying and it comes off. Then I use the wire cutter part of the multi-tool to bend the stops open slightly. I use scissors to cut the zipper tape at a 1/2 inch above where the zipper will end, and then an X-Acto knife to finish cutting the tape between the teeth. Use a lighter to melt the ends. Now to remove the extra teeth. I'm using a pair of dikes to clip off the metal teeth right at the base of the tape. I'm taking off a few teeth below the mark so there's room for the stops. I use the Leatherman to squish the stops back over the tape from the outside, and there you go, little bitty zipper. Now I'm going to sew on the fake binding the same way that I did for the front. Mark the seam allowance, mark the stitch line, pin, sew, and make sure the binding matches up at the back. I want one more little piece of fake binding at the open side seam, so I marked where the back piece's binding ends on the front piece. Then I can pin about a 1/2 inch extended above the mark for a small seam allowance. I'm sewing exactly to that mark and folding the extra over the line, then stitching that down too. Then I can press the binding over and cut away the extra seam allowance. On the back pieces, it's time to put in the zipper. I've pinned the zipper with the top and bottom seam allowances in mind, and I'm sewing close to the tape with the zipper foot. Then press the center back of the lining so it won't cover the zipper. Then pin and sew the lining in place at the top and bottom only. It's like a little tube. Now the not so fun part, understitching. It's really pretty important, so don't skip this step. I'm sewing the seam allowance onto the lining close to the stitch line. This helps the fabrics fold where they're supposed to, it keeps them from gaping, it makes your garment look really good. But you can see how little visibility I have in this little tube. Just take it slowly. The last thing to do at the back is give the pieces a good press and then hand sew the lining onto the zipper tape. Time to attach the back bodice to the front bodice. I marked out the seam allowance for the front so I can see exactly where to line up the back piece, since it's already finished. Then I'm pinning exactly at the start of the lower binding. Now, finally, I can sew on the front lining. I tucked in the straps and back pieces and started pinning the two together. I'm sewing all along the edges except the bottom. With that sewn, I need to trim the extra seam allowances at the points. I like to put my thumbnail right on the sewn point and trim around it, knowing I won't cut through the thread. I'm trimming the leather back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then snipping into the seam allowances at the curves so it doesn't pucker when it's flipped. To know if I've snipped the curve enough, I gently pull the edge straight to make sure there's no tension at the seam. I'm carefully flipping the bodice right side out. This is a point turner. I'm using it to press the points out at the shoulders. Instead of understitching like the pattern says, I'm going to top stitch the leather and stitch in the ditch at the binding. Now the bodice is done. In the next video, I'll show you how I sewed the skirt and finished the dress.